Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the National Security Space Association's SpaceTime interview series. Thanks for being with us today. My name is Steve Jacques, the association's executive director, filling in today for Chris Williams, who is chair of our newly renamed Mormon Center for Space Studies. Many of you may have just seen our announcement, and we are deeply, deeply honored to carry the Mormon name. We're also honored to have with us today Todd Harrison, Kaitlyn Johnson, Makena Young, who are the authors of the recently released Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS report, entitled Defense Against the Dark Arts in Space, Protecting Space Systems from Counterspace Weapons. Todd, Kaitlyn, and Makena, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your insightful report and welcome. Todd, also, thanks for your service as a member of our NSSA Board of Advisors. We're also joined by the one and the only Doug Livero. Like Todd, really needs no introduction, but he did formerly serve as the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, among many other important jobs, and also penned the foreword for this report. So like Todd, Doug serves as a distinguished member of the NSSA Board of Directors. Doug, thanks very much for your participation and your great service. The CSIS report is both timely and illuminating. For those of you who have not yet read it, we strongly encourage you to do so. It takes as a given an ever-expanding threat environment and discusses adversary kinetic, physical, non-kinetic, physical, electronic, and cyber counterspace systems. It also postulates a wide range of self-defense measures that, if implemented, could help strengthen the resilience of U.S. space systems and architectures. I'm sure we'll hear more from Todd, Kaitlyn, and Makena on these important topics. The report states unequivocally, quote, the fact that space is contested does not mean space is undefendable. Rather, it means the United States will have to fight to protect its ability to operate in this domain, just as it does in the air, land, and maritime domains. What is needed are strategy, doctrine, operational concepts, and technical capabilities that focus on protecting space systems, the services they provide, and the space environment itself, end quote. We strongly agree with this fundamental point. In addition, we believe the report reinforces a central point that to address growing counterspace threats, the U.S. must adopt a layered approach to space systems security and resilience. No single action or approach is sufficient to solve the problem, but a series of carefully considered measures working together can significantly enhance the robustness and resilience of the U.S. space systems and architectures. Chris Williams raised this very point in a recent SpaceTime interview with Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Hyten. He asked whether General Hyten agreed that a layered approach, one that includes a broad range of passive and active features and measures that challenge adversary tactics and reduce our vulnerability to adversary attacks, was the best way to enhance the survivability and resilience to U.S. national space system architectures. His response was yes. A layered defense is the only approach to effectively addressing the challenge of increasing threats to U.S. space systems. In this regard, the report we're discussing today does a highly commendable job in laying out the broad range of response options available to the United States. Whether or to what extent the U.S. taking full advantage of these options is certainly one of the many topics for today's discussion. A quick note for our format today. In a moment, I'll turn this over to Todd for opening comments he wishes to make, along with Kaitlyn and Makena, and certainly not last but not least, Doug. Once their opening remarks are completed, we'll launch into the Q&A session. I'll pose a question or two, but our audience is strongly encouraged to submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We may not have time to get to all the questions, but we'll certainly do our best. So with that, thanks again for everyone for being here and to our distinguished speakers. Todd, great to see you. Congratulations to you and your co-authors on an excellent report. The floor is now yours.
Thanks, Steve. It's a great honor to be here on SpaceTime. I just wanted to say a few words at the beginning on why we did this report. We did this report because, we've done our annual space threat assessment each year for, I think, going on 4 years now, in conjunction with the folks over at the Secure World Foundation, making the point every year that there are a variety of threats to our space systems that are out there. But what we started to hear more and more in the discussion around DC is it was sinking in that there were threats to our space systems, that our space systems were vulnerable to attack. But for some people, the thinking stopped there. And some were starting to draw the incorrect conclusion that space was not defendable, and that we should just turn away from space, pivot away from space. Some even wrote op-eds, basically making this point that we've got to turn away from space. So that's when we thought it was really important to, talk about the other side of the equation. Yes, there are threats to space systems. There are ways to protect yourself as well. And in fact, as this report highlights, there are a variety of different ways that we'll walk through as part of the briefing today. But to do that, you really have to think through a lot of different variables, including how are you going to potentially use these defenses, in what situations might they be relevant or not relevant. And so, that's where we brought in our good friend of CSIS, Doug Lavero, to help with the thinking through the scenarios part of this report, and thinking through, how we should approach the idea of using space defenses. So, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Doug. First of all, he made some important points in the foreword of this report, and I just want to ask him to share that with the group before we get into the rest of it. So, Doug, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Todd and Steve. Thanks to you and NSSA for hosting this thing. And by the way, for those of you who are watching on this on video and are confused about where Todd, myself, Makena, and Kaitlyn are all sitting, we are somewhere lost in Universal Studios Harry Potter theme park. There's a prize for whoever can guess to which is where each setting that each of us is in, or at least I just made that up, and I'm sure that Todd will back it with some dollars from CSIS. So seriously, so first of all, I do want to thank Todd for asking me to do this. This is a lot of fun to go ahead and do this. This is not the first space war game that we have ever done. We've been doing space war games for quite a long time. Mostly the most famous ones are the Shriva War Games, which have been run by Air Force Space Command for almost 2 decades, if not longer than that, and now by the Space Forces. And many of them have involved, I'm sure, people who are sitting on this line. And if anybody's been in those Shriva War Games, the answer is we always lose. And that really doesn't tell you that much about how to go ahead and use space capabilities. And one of the things that Steve mentioned in his intro was the criticality of doctrine and strategy as we move forward in the space realm. And so in the forward that Todd mentioned, I wanted to talk about how do you develop strategy and doctrine? How's that been done in the past, and how do we do it now in space? Because that truly is the key for exercises such as we've done with the CSIS report here. Strategy and doctrine is really the lessons learned from years, decades, and sometimes centuries of warfare. And for land warfare and sea warfare, we have those centuries, actually millennia, to go ahead and depend upon. And even for air warfare, we have almost a century now of air operations for us to go ahead and start to really hone air doctrine. But for space, we don't have many years of space experience, and we have almost no years. In fact, really, we have no years of space warfighting experience. And so we start with a blank slate. The page literally is unwritten. Now, that's not that fair to the Space Force. They did write an initial doctrine back in June 2020 called a Space Capstone Doctrine for Space Forces. But it really is what I would call the initial entree, the initial thoughts to be put down in paper. And the way you hone doctrine is you have to either go into battle, which nobody wants to do, or you at least have to go into play battle, which is what we did here. And this is very reminiscent of what the Navy did between World War I and World War II in terms of the naval fleet problems that they tried to solve, where they used aircraft carriers for the first time, even though they'd never been used in warfare before, and obviously held the Navy in good stead when they were forced to rely on aircraft carriers at the beginning of World War I. So this is the first of what I see as many different kinds of studies in the how do you solve different kinds of problems. And we'll talk about those kind of problems when we get to that part of Todd's briefing, but how do you solve different kinds of problems in space? And what is the doctrine and strategy and eventually the equipment that you need and the training that you need and the thinking that you need to go ahead and win in such a conflict. So I'll stop there and move on. Thanks, Todd.
All right, Kaitlyn is up next.
Thanks, Todd. I'm here to introduce just the beginning of this report, a bit more of the scene setting of why we wanted to write this report and why we think it's necessary. First, I think in addition to what Todd and Doug, rightfully described, when we told people we were going to embark on this effort and write this report, we got a lot of comments back about how this material is classified and there's no way that we could possibly write a report on defenses for space systems. And I think this report in its infancy, there was a little bit of motivation for us to prove people wrong, that a lot of these defenses are either well known or based on technical principles on the laws of physics for a lot of these defenses, and we needed to bring this into the public conversation instead of allowing it to remain behind closed doors, being discussed by people in SCIFs, not because the material was classified, but because it was inaccessible. And that was a driving factor for bringing this discussion into the open, and we hope to see a lot more public discussion on how we can create layered defenses for our space systems, even as we acknowledge that space has not been a sanctuary and is increasingly used for military purposes and weaponization. As Todd mentioned, we write an annual report on Counterspace, a Counterspace assessment. It's going to be released in April, so be on the lookout for that one. But in this report, we kind of revisit a lot of these principles at the beginning of, space is more diverse, it's more disruptive. We're seeing companies take roles that once belonged only to nation states. We're seeing companies that have, more satellites than many nation states. I think SpaceX outnumbers definitely China. That's my last look, but is inching on the United States as well. And we wanted to present a framework for types of space weapon. This was some research that we had done in a previous report that we wanted to carry into this one to really set people up for understanding both what are the different types of space weapons we're talking about, and then lead into that discussion about defenses for space weapons and really matrix these together. And I think Todd is going to go through that matrix a little bit later in this discussion. But to simplify things, we think about space weapons in an Earth to space, and space to Earth, whether they are kinetic and causing kinetic damage or non-kinetic. Personally, from our Counterspace assessment, we're seeing Russia and China really invest in these non-kinetic Earth to space weapons that could possibly translate, later into space to space or even space to Earth technology. And I think Makena is going to go a bit deeper into all of these different counterspace weapons and how we define them. But I just want to make it clear that we are not acting, and I think the attendees on this call will acknowledge this as well, that we're not acting in a peaceful, benign domain anymore. No, and it maybe has never been as such. There's some great research from the Aerospace Corporation by Robin Dickey, who talks about this in great detail in the history of the term sanctuary, but we need to move past this and really talk about the bigger questions, which is how can the United States and our allies best defend our national security space assets, but also, perhaps encourage our commercial partners who are playing a much bigger role in defending their satellites as well. So, Makena.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. So on top of the framework Kaitlyn laid out, I'm going to talk about how we at the Aerospace Security Project define these dark arts in space. So we break them up into 4 categories, or houses, if you will, of counter-space weapons. The first is kinetic physical. This gets the most public attention because it's the easiest to spot. It happens where everyone can watch, people know what's going on. This includes direct descent ASAT weapons, which is when a missile is shot up into space and destroys a satellite, creates debris, completely destroys the satellite. And we've only seen this demonstrated in tests. It hasn't been used as an act of war yet, and it seems to be kind of unlikely, but multiple countries have this capability. Another form is a co-orbital ASAT test, where an object in space maneuvers into the proximity of another object in space, and it can go from object to object, kind of bouncing around. And there are also ground station attacks. So, taking out a ground station can completely stop, an actor from being able to control their own assets in space. Another category is non-kinetic physical. These weapons have physical effects on a satellite without actually touching the object. This includes laser systems that can dazzle or blind the sensors on a satellite, high-powered microwaves or electromagnetic pulses that can just kind of, really fry the different systems on a satellite. We also have electronic forms of attack, which are mainly uplink and downlink jamming and spoofing. This concentrates on the signals that go to and from a satellite and targets specific signals that are being communicated with that satellite. And then we have cyber, which is being used in all types of domains. Cyber attacks on space system largely focus on data interception or monitoring, data corruption, and they can go through the user equipment or through ground stations. And the effects vary, but they can take full seizure and full control of a satellite. So each of these forms of attack have varying degrees of public awareness, attribution, and some are actually reversible, but they all can cause serious damage to an asset in space. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Todd.
All right, thanks, Makena. So next I want to talk about what are these different defenses. So, as Makena talked about, these are the different types of counter space weapons. I'm going to talk about how do you defend against them. And so we divided them into 2 broad groups. There are passive defenses and your active defenses. And so your passive defenses, shown here, I categorized them into 3 different types. Your architectural defenses on the left-hand side, those are different types of constellations, architectures, the ways that you could design your space system. So you can use things like disaggregation, breaking up the different missions into multiple satellites, distributed constellations where the capability is distributed across multiple systems in order for a user to be able to use it, like GPS as a distributed constellation. Proliferated constellations, that's where you just launch very large numbers of satellites. Diversified architectures, that could include an air-breathing layer or terrestrial layer, as well as multiple orbital regimes in space. So you're just diversifying where your assets are that are part of your system. And of course, the ground stations can be part of this as well. You can have an architecture with redundant, mobile, or hardened ground stations. And of course, you can have architectures that do, multiple of these at the same time. And we see some of the new programs being planned, by DoD and the Space Development Agency in particular. They leverage, distribution and proliferation and diversification all at the same time. Now, the second category of your passive defenses are technical defenses, right? So first would be exquisite space domain awareness. So here we're talking about awareness of what's happening in the space domain that is beyond, what can be, easily attained by other countries or even by commercial companies as well. And it's not just understanding what objects are there and where are they moving and where are they going to be in the future. It's also understanding what are they doing, characterizing those objects, and to the second point, understanding what's going on in the RF spectrum in space, being able to map, who's operating what frequency and where and at what time and where are their antennas pointed. All of those two things together give you a much deeper, richer understanding of what's actually happening in the space environment, which can actually make all the other types of defenses more effective. The third one down the list, antenna nulling and adaptive filtering. That's ways of blocking out jamming, electromagnetic shielding to protect the electronics against high power microwaves, EMP pulses, things of that nature. Filtering and shuttering for your sensors, sensitive sensors, protect you from laser blinding and things like that. Jam resistant waveforms seems like a no-brainer, but that's something that we've been slow to adopt across the military, just using waveforms that are more difficult to jam. And of course, encryption and air gap systems, particularly on the ground segment and the user segment. Now, there's also a whole other category of what we call operational defenses. And that is basically changing the way you operate in order to make yourself harder to attack, right? So you could use things like stealth, trying to conceal your satellite or make it more difficult for someone to find it and track it. You can also use operational techniques like rapid deployment. You could keep a capability on the ground, and when it's needed, you could rapidly launch it, either at the beginning of a conflict or later in a conflict. Reconstitution is similar, slightly different. Reconstitution is once one of your space assets has been destroyed or degraded in some way, having more of that capability that you can launch and replenish the constellation during a conflict. Deception and decoys can, of course, be used in combination with stealth, to either fool people into thinking your satellite does something it doesn't actually do, or concealing the capability that it might have. And then maneuver gets talked about a lot. I think that's because space came out of the Air Force and fighter pilots like to think about outmaneuvering threats. It's much more difficult in space. The physics aren't on your side. If you're a 5,000 kilogram satellite and you've got a tiny warhead coming at you, it's going to outmaneuver you. And you've got a limited amount of propellant on board. So that's something that you've got to plan for and build into your system from the beginning. Now, those are your different types of passive space defenses. There are also a whole range of active defenses. And so the difference with active defenses is you're actually trying to proactively target the threat before it can target you. And so we divide those into space-based and terrestrial-based. So your space-based active defenses are things that reside in space. They can either be on the satellite you're trying to protect, or it could be on a free-flying satellite that acts as basically a bodyguard for other satellites. You can use jamming and spoofing. So for example, if there's an incoming ASAT warhead, you could jam the radar or other sensors on it. You could spoof it. Kind of like what we do in other domains. In the air domain, we have spoofing pods, that can fool enemy radars, to make them think that the plane is in a different location, or that, one plane is actually 5 planes. You could, do something similar for ASAT weapons in space. You could also use laser dazzling to target optical or infrared sensors that are on an incoming ASAT warhead. You could have a shoot back system that is kinetic, firing a small projectile in order to intercept and destroy an ASAT warhead as it approaches you. And one that we found interesting that really came up a lot in the scenarios that Doug's going to talk about in a second is a physical seizure capability. That is the ability to grab another object in space, an object that may not be responsive or cooperative, and be able to take that and move it to a safe location. Now, your terrestrial-based active defenses, that would include things like cyber attacks against another country's ground systems that are controlling its counterspace weapons, jamming and spoofing so that an adversary can't necessarily communicate with their own space assets that are being used to launch an attack against you. Of course, you could resort to a direct ascent ASAT weapon. If someone's got you know, a co-orbital ASAT weapon, you know, that's threatening one of your satellites, you could try to shoot it down with a direct ascent weapon. And then the last one is just regular old attacks in other domains, you know, using air, sea, and land-based platforms to launch kinetic attacks on the ground, going after launch sites or command and control facilities that support another country's counterspace weapons that might be used against you. So that, you know, as you can see here, there's a whole host of different defenses that you can employ to keep your space systems safe, make them less vulnerable. The next thing that we looked at in the report is, all right, if you've got these range of defenses available to you, how do you actually apply them? And, you know, what threats are they good against? Well, the first thing that comes up is you have to remember that, you know, the defenses you use depend not only on the way that you're being attacked, but what is the objective of the attacker? What's the objective of the defender in a given situation? So, you know, for an attacker, their objectives could range from just inflicting economic harm against the United States. They could be using an attack or a threat of attack in space to signal resolve. They might be trying to deter the United States from getting involved in a conflict on Earth. They could, you know, once we're actually in an active conflict, attacks on space systems could and likely would be used to try to disrupt our sensor to shooter kill chain. Nations have also talked, countries like China and Russia in particular, have talked about using anti-satellite weapons essentially as a penetration aid for their missile forces to be able to, you know, weaken our missile defenses by taking out, you know, missile warning capabilities, for example, and making it more likely that their missiles will make it through. And then, of course, you know, the objectives of attacker could include, you know, all the way up to trying to permanently alter the balance of power in space. Now, for the defender, you know, your objectives also, you know, could vary quite a bit depending on the specific situation you find yourself in. So you could, you know, at a smaller scope of objective could just be to deter conflict from extending into space. So basically acknowledging there's going to be a conflict on the ground or there's potential for one, and just trying to make an adversary realize that, you know, it's not worth it to them to try to escalate that conflict or expand it into the space domain. You could also use space defenses just to buy time for operations in other domains to be effective. So, you know, instead of trying to completely defeat an attack or make yourself completely invulnerable, you could just limit the damage and try to hang on for longer until your forces in other domains can beat back the adversary. Now, you know, a more assertive posture or objective would be, okay, well, what if we want to actually defeat an attack and quickly restore capabilities? That's going to be more challenging. You need much more, extensive space defense systems if you're going to do that. And then, of course, the most challenging objective for a defender would be to permanently shift the balance of power in space. So, you know, make it so that at the end of this conflict, if an adversary has attacked you in space, you're going to roll back their space and counterspace capabilities so that they no longer pose a threat in the future. Now, you know, once you consider all of those types of factors, then you can start to think about how do I match different defenses to the different types of threats that we face in the space domain. So this chart, I'm not going to go through all of it. It's more of an eye chart, but it just takes you through kind of a crosswalk looking at all the different types of defenses that we talked about across the top, and then cross-reference to all the different types of counter-space weapons that Makena talked about earlier. Now, keep in mind that, you know, a particular defense may be effective against some types of counterspace weapons within a particular category, but not all of them. And so, you know, this gives you an idea of where different types of defenses are going to help you. So, for example, your active defenses, they're much more helpful, for kinetic physical and non-kinetic physical forms of attack. Your architectural defenses actually have a lot of broad applications across a lot of different types of threats. But this is, part of the decision making you have to go through in thinking about what do we need, to build into our future space architectures. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Doug to walk through some of the scenarios that we used in workshops to help think through these problems as part of this study. So Doug, over to you.
Thanks, Todd. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through these because I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions, and we're already halfway through our time. So I will just briefly go ahead and talk about these different scenarios. In general, I think it's important to say as an opening comment, what we did not do is we did not go ahead and put this into the context of peer-on-peer phase 2 combat, where shooting is happening everywhere, and we have active, massive incidents against space objects as part of this. We could have done that, but those kind of things, as I said, we do that in the Schriever war games a lot, and a lot of times those devolve into a game of losses and who loses their capability first. And it isn't as interesting, especially when you look at some of the architectural and passive and active defenses that Todd has talked about how they would really work in these kind of scenarios. So we picked 4 different scenarios against with different kinds of threats, and in many cases, the threats were somewhat ambiguous. These are not clear threats, and that's one of the most important things to recognize in space conflict, is that threats are not necessarily going to be very clear. They're not going to be understood. It's going to be very hard in some cases to actually tell, was that an intentional attack or not? And for example, on this first scenario that we have with Russia going into the Baltics, there was fundamentally a satellite that they repositioned and claimed to have lost control of. It just so happens that they lost control of it when it was very, very near an AHF satellite, and actually was interfering with its NC3 mission. And the U.S. took that as a warning: stay out of this. This our incursion in the Baltics. The Baltics is our backyard. You have more to lose to gain. And so this goes to some of the things that Todd talked about in terms of deterring the U.S. from entering action by threatening space assets. And in fact, they took it a step further by showing that they could go ahead and physically destroy GPS satellites if the U.S. went any further. And so it provided the U.S. Command authorities with a conundrum. Do we help in the Baltics, or do we go ahead and assure that we don't lose GPS? And if we want to assure that, how is something like the Space Force going to go ahead and quickly react to this unexpected attack that we saw in space? Several of these other scenarios are fairly complex and interesting. The wide area GPS jamming in scenario number 3 was not necessarily a military aim thing, but mostly a political event that China was demonstrating that there is no right to broadcast GPS into other nations, and that nations can, if they choose, go ahead and jam GPS. And how do we deal with that? And how do we deal with the blinding of commercial imagery? There is no right in international law for commercial imaging satellites, or national imaging satellites for that matter, to peer into other countries. We allow that to happen, but there's no right to do it. And so the Chinese were within their rights to jam GPS and to blind satellites trying to look into their country. We also threw in a cislunar threat, because cislunar is a fun thing that people have talked about, and so we put in there an ambiguous cislunar reentry event, and whether or not it was going to go ahead and interact with a geosatellite. I think the last scenario was the most interesting. This was more like the North Koreans attacking Sony than the Russian state attacking the GPS satellites. This was the Iranians using a high power microwave attack against U.S. commercial satellites in response to sanctions that the U.S. had used against Iran. And so this was very much in the, okay, what is the responsibility of the Space Force to help defend those commercial satellites. Interestingly enough, one of the things that that I thought was pretty fascinating here was Todd talked about how sometimes defenses against satellite attacks can happen terrestrially in a kinetic attack on the Earth. And oftentimes we think, well, that doesn't really make much sense. Just because we've had a satellite attack doesn't mean we're going to start bombing somebody else's territory. But in this particular scenario, the uplink station to control this microwave satellite was actually in Venezuela, and we had looked at sending soft forces in to go ahead and take down the site. That would be a terrestrial attack to go ahead and support the counterspace activities, but it wasn't a quote bombing event. It was more of a surreptitious entry by special forces to go ahead and interfere with the site. So a wide range of scenarios, all of them at less than full-on peer-to-peer conflict levels, where we saw the benefits of different kinds of responses, and in most cases, the responses that we found most interesting were not the ones that we often think about in terms of anti-satellite attacks, but more of the lower level ones that Todd has laid out in his previous chart, and that I think we're going to talk about on the next couple of charts. So I'll turn it back to you, Todd.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, so I'm just going to go through quickly, some of the big takeaways from this study. The first takeaway, especially from the scenarios that we went through and the workshops that we used to walk through those with a range of experts from the space community and broader national security community. One of those takeaways was that we really need to place a priority on improving space domain awareness capabilities, to include more space-based sensors and better integration with some of the commercial and friendly foreign government space surveillance networks that are already out there and being built. And also, it looks like there is a lot of potential to use artificial intelligence to help analyze the massive amounts of data coming in from these systems and get a better understanding of, what an adversary is actually up to on a day-to-day basis, what are their capabilities, and what are their intentions in a crisis scenario? How have they changed their normal pattern of operations in space? Second recommendation is closely related to that. It's that we need to, as a U.S. government, need to place more effort on developing improved indications and warnings for space. And the reason for this is to give decision makers more time and information so that they can tailor defensive responses to whatever specific circumstances might arise in a conflict, because that's going to be the hard thing for decision makers, is understanding what's going on, what are my options to respond, and am I responding in a way that is proportionate to what the adversary is intending to do, not just what I'm seeing them do. Third recommendation is that we need new space architectures that use, in particular, a combination of distribution, proliferation, and diversification of orbits. For too long, we have been wedded to these architectures. To quote General Hyten, I think General Raymond has used this phraseology, and I think it actually goes back to a RAND strategist called Amron Katz. We've been too reliant on big, juicy targets. That is a small number of very high value space assets in geosynchronous orbit. And we've got to have more diverse architectures. They don't necessarily need to replace some of those existing legacy systems, but we need them to supplement and diversify the capabilities that we already have. The fourth recommendation is that we ought to look at non-kinetic active defenses. And I know active defenses, can get a lot of people riled up, especially in the arms control community. But non-kinetic active defenses, things like onboard jamming and lasing systems to blind the sensors on, things like co-orbital ASAT weapons or direct ascent ASAT weapons. Those are things that could be very valuable and very needed. And it actually, would end up would disincentivize an adversary from trying to use those capabilities in a conflict. And one of the things that came out of the workshops also is this physical seizure capability. That could be a system that also doubles as an inspector, an on-orbit servicing satellite, but being able to grab a non-cooperative satellite is a much more challenging problem, but that's something that we ought to be exploring. Fifth recommendation is that we need to look at new options to improve DoD's integration with commercial space operators. And in particular, looking at something like the Civil Reserve Air Fleet program, if those of you are familiar with that on the airlift side, we ought to be thinking through how do we set up something like that with commercial space companies so that we know that they will be there for us when we need them, but also having that contract vehicle in place actually gives the government an ability to start incentivizing commercial space companies to add some technical defenses of their own to their space systems. The sixth one is we need a better understanding of the operational, political, and strategic risks that are involved with using certain types of defenses, in particular, stealth, maneuver, rapid deployment, and reconstitution. There are some real downsides to these. There are upsides as well. But we need to really understand how we're going to use them, what we're going to get out of these capabilities, what threats are they effective against before we start just pouring money into these things blindly. The seventh is we need more analysis and gaming about gray zone competition in space. So as Doug talked about, the peer-to-peer conflict, phase 2 operations. I think, we've got our hands around that as a space community. But what about, this creeping kind of gray zone competition in space? Things like reversible attacks or threats of attack, or attack, types of attack that have very limited ability to attribute where it came from. Those are the things we need to think about. Okay, how do we respond? And in what cases is it okay to not respond? And in what cases do we absolutely need to have a response, and what is proportional? So, with that, I want to turn it back over to Steve. I just, a little plug here for our team at CSIS. You can download, all of our work. We have created a sub-site within the CSIS main site called aerospace.csis.org. That's the easiest way to get to all of our publications, not just this publication, but our annual space threat assessment and some of our other work as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Steve. We can go to Q&A.
You bet. Thanks, everybody, and good to repeat those bestsellers you just put out there, Todd and team. Outstanding reads for sure, and a great synopsis by you all. So thank you. So we'll turn over to questions. I see a couple are popping up in the Q&A. Let me kick this off by asking, in your report, you note that nearly by any definition, space has already been weaponized. So could you please discuss the difference between militarization of space and weaponization of space, and which nations have placed weapons in space already? And in this regard, isn't the weaponization of space by America's adversaries what's driving bipartisan efforts here in our country that began in the Obama administration to enhance U.S. space systems resilience?
Yeah, I can jump in there first. So, generally, if you look at the literature, militarization of space refers to using space for military purposes. And of course, the United States and other countries have done that since the beginning of the space age. A lot of the initial uses of space were for military purposes. And really as Doug has written about previously, really, they were focused on supporting our strategic forces in particular. So space has been militarized from the beginning. There's no question about that. Now, the weaponization of space, that depends on what you consider to be a space weapon. And the chart that Kaitlyn showed before, we put together a framework for how you think about that. And I would just jump right to the bottom line. I think just about anyone would say a satellite in space that is capable of kinetically attacking another satellite in space is a space weapon. If that's not a space weapon, I don't know what is. And so has space been weaponized? Absolutely. It's been weaponized since the 1960s. So the Soviets started testing their first co-orbital ASAT system back in 1963, I believe. And they just recently tested it, a different and more modern system this past summer. In July, US Space Command publicly called out Russia for testing what appeared to be firing a projectile from one satellite towards another satellite in space. So, you know, looking at it that way, I think you have to conclude that space has already been weaponized as well. It's been weaponized for decades. And so you know, instead of debating about whether or not space has been weaponized, whether or not we should weaponize space, we need to be focusing on, you know, what's here in front of us. And the question in front of us is, how do we better defend our space systems?
Let me, Steve, let me add on to what to what Todd said. You know, I think sometimes we get hooked into these terms of militarization versus weaponization. I wrote a piece a while back that I think is important for everybody to understand. You know, space is part of the DoD's kill chain all the time. Whether or not space actually has active weapons in it or not, space is part of the kill chain. When a sailor pushes the button on a ship to launch a Tomahawk missile, he's done it because the targeting was done by a space asset. The guidance for the system is being done by a space asset. The communication in real time to the Tomahawk, if necessary, if they want to do that, is done by a space asset. And the battle damage assessment is done by a space assets in general. So space is part of the targeting chain. And as I've argued in many papers, that makes it a fair game for adversaries and for us to go ahead and attack that targeting chain. It is absolutely, under the laws of armed conflict, 100% allowed to attack parts of that targeting chain. In fact, it's, as I've argued, the sovereign duty of a nation to do so if that's the easiest way they can use to prevent attacks on their own capabilities. So we have to recognize that this is a natural thing that is well understood in the laws of armed conflict, and we are going to have to face up to it, regardless of whether the weapons are in space, coming from the Earth to space, or anywhere in between.
Thank you. I'll toss a few softballs coming out of from our attendees. From Robert Taylor, please address what constitutes an act of war in space. And from one of our anonymous attendees, have you considered the cost of the defenses we're talking about, at least on a relative basis? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the, you know, the definition of an act of war in space, that is something that we discussed extensively in the workshops we held to go through the scenarios. And if you actually read through the scenarios in the report, you know, we put the, you know, kind of the full write-up of the scenario, the questions that we asked the participants, we put all that in the report, because if people want to replicate that and do it themselves with their own groups, you're welcome to it. And that is one of the big questions that we kept coming back to is, you know, okay, we've postulated, you know, the X, Y, and Z happened in this scenario. Does that constitute an act of war? Is that armed conflict? Is it a hostile act? How do you want to define it? And I would say that there is no clear consensus in the groups. You know, for a lot of these scenarios, people were on different sides of saying whether or not they thought it constituted an act of war. Because, you know, there are some legal and geopolitical ramifications from, well, you know, if you consider that an act of war, then you're at war. And a lot of things, a lot more options become available to you in terms of how you respond. I don't know if, you know, Kaitlyn or Makena, if you guys had thoughts, you know, from the scenarios when we discussed that very question.
Yeah, I would just highlight that we made sure to include some space lawyers in our discussions and our workshops to help us address this question exactly. And as Todd said, you know, participants came down on all sides. I would also just highlight the two international efforts that are ongoing to evaluate international law for space, the Woomera Manual and the Millimos Project. I think they're both going to be, you know, at least for the space community, hot sellers when they do get released, and hopefully they address some of these areas. But we didn't dive too super deep into this question because we are not space lawyers, and that was not really the focus of the study. But it was a really interesting finding to me that it wasn't clear, and a pretty worrisome finding, I think, as well.
Thank you.
Steve, you're also asking that question about the costs. So I don't think we got that
I
part.
don't think we hit that just right. Yeah, please take on the cost question.
Yeah, it's a really important question. When you think about the what the Chinese and the Russians are doing in space, some people call it a cost imposition strategy. Go ahead and threaten our space system, so we'll have to spend a lot of extra money on defending them. And this is actually one of the things we didn't investigate, and I think is a fascinating question about what is the proper investment to defend against these things, and how does that cost shake out? If you invest in an active defense, that active defense may defend your satellite, but it's a cost above and beyond the cost of the capability. If you invest in some architectural options, for example, like proliferation, you actually end up getting more capability and you get defense out of it as well. So that cost goes directly into more capability, which 99% of the time when you're in peace, you're going to end up using that more capability. And then in the 1% of the time you're at war, it actually acts as a defense. This is why, in my mind, those kind of architectural solutions are far superior, because every dollar you invest in them is fundamentally more capability that you get out of your space systems for you to use for the next 20 years. And then a passive defense that you get to use during that short time of war.
Thank you. Anybody else on that question?
Yeah, I would just add that, when you think through, especially some of the technical defenses, in a lot of cases, if it's something that's going on your satellite, additional hardware, like for electromagnetic shielding or for filtering and shuttering, antennas for nulling, things like that, it's going to eat into, size, weight, and power. And so it could have some incremental, cost implication there. And then, things like operational defenses. If you really want to be able to maneuver quickly, then, you're talking, carrying a lot more propellant, having larger thrusters that you can use, or maybe, designing a satellite to be refueled in orbit. So there could be some, ripple effects from some of these options. And I think that cost absolutely has to be a factor when you're thinking through, all right, what kind of defenses do I need? What am I trying to protect against? And what are my cost trade-offs? But, as Doug said, in some cases, that cost accounting is not going to be clear, right? Because, it's giving you more defensive capability. It's also giving you more capacity. And so, how do you account for that? I think that, it's not a simple question to answer.
Thank you. An ongoing question is probably worth bringing up for a moment from Mitch Rios. How do we handle the overclassification of space and all the caveats that exist in space? We've been talking about this problem for a long time, but what are the tangible actions that need to occur to reduce the overclassification of space? In 2 minutes or less.
Yeah, Doug, you want to take that first?
Well, I don't want to take it first, but I will. This is one of those questions. It's sort of this is one of those questions which sounds when you ask it like, why don't we have world peace? Why are we fighting over this? Why can't we just declassify things? And there's two things to say here. Number one, space has been overclassified for like ever. It is a habit in space to be overclassified. And so that the existence of that habit sometimes leads us to believe that all classification is bad. That's an incorrect conclusion as well. And that's why it's taken us so long to figure out how to tweeze those two things apart. What is overclassification that harms us, and what is classification that helps us? I've always asked people, what's the top speed of a U.S. aircraft carrier? And nobody can tell me because it's classified. I know it's fast enough that the entire crew can water ski behind the aircraft carrier, and it's probably got enough power to do it as well, but I don't know how fast it can go. And yet nobody complains that the speed of an aircraft carrier is classified because it isn't important. So classification has become almost a bludgeon on the space community. And by the way, even our own military leaders often talk about the classification of space. And there are things in space that are classified that don't need to be, because they are perfectly obvious to the world. I can go on a website and look up the name and every caveat behind any NRO satellite that exists today. I can find it anywhere in the world. I can find its ephemeris data. I can find all those other kind of things. And yet we still classify those things unlike the fact that we don't classify the names of the 12 US aircraft carriers. We still classify how fast they can go. And that's a division of classification that's important to do. The other harmful side of classification is if we don't declassify these capabilities, it's hard to plan to use them in war. And in fact, one of the things we did while I was in the Pentagon was to declassify. And when we say declassify here, we mean take it out of special access channels and put it more into the top secret channels, where electronic warfare capabilities could now be used in war planning by individuals without SCI SAP clearances. And so this is an important question. I don't want to make light of the question, but I also don't want to say that it's just not pure declassify everything. There are some capabilities which will only remain useful if they are classified. And that means that they have to be designed to stay classified in use. The minute you have something that is classified only in non-use, becomes a stricture against using that capability. And in fact, Steve and I can tell you in the history of space warfare, where there were systems we were afraid to use because it would end up exposing their existence, and we were waiting for a bigger battle to use them in. And that's not a good place to be either.
No, you don't want that.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Steve, that, to pull on the thread Doug talked about, when it comes to deterrence, some of these space defensive capabilities, one of the main reasons you might want to deploy them is to discourage an adversary from trying to attack you in a certain way, right? You want to change their calculus. You want to make them realize that they are less likely to succeed, or that it's going to be more costly to them in order to launch a certain type of attack. Now, if that is the part of the intent of fielding a certain type of space defense, then you absolutely need to be able to communicate that. You don't have to give all the technical details, but you at least have to be able to communicate publicly or through private channels that a capability like this exists. And if you keep it completely secret and you don't even tell your allies and partners, you don't even tell other parts of the US government, well, that's not helping. That's not helping deterrence. So if the intent is to deter, you have to communicate.
Exactly. You're right. Well, we're running close on time, and I'll try to squeeze one last one in here because I think it's quite good, coming from Lindsay Millard at OSDR&E. What would be your top 2 broad technology areas to invest in to counter adversary capabilities?
Kaitlyn or Makena, do you guys want to
There you go.
take that one? I'm happy to jump in too, but.
Yeah, I can start off. I think my number one threat to start, being able to defend against it are cyber threats. I think that's something that we see countries like Iran and North Korea, who don't have huge other space capabilities. They're growing their cyber commands and they have real capability in that area. And I think a lot of smaller countries are starting to have capabilities for cyber commands as well. So that's my number one priority.
Thank you. Any last comments, Kaitlyn?
Yeah, I would just jump in and add that my number 2 priority would be to better defend our satellites against jamming. It is definitely the most proliferated counterspace weapon we see in open source intelligence, and being used, around the world in many of these lower end conflict areas of regular warfare. And so not just protecting the military signal, but civilian signal of GPS and our communications that we rely on so heavily, both at the user end, but also, from the satellite itself.
Great, thank you. And thanks to you all. This has been an extraordinary event. Thanks to all of you on the screen here. Thanks to the great questions and for the participants being a part of this with all the great questions. Pretty much concludes today. Our next event will be next Thursday, which is the 25th of the month. I believe it's at 11 a.m. It'll be Lieutenant General John Shaw of the U.S. Space Command. It ought to be a good one as well. So thank you again to everybody. We really appreciate it. It's been an extraordinary event.
Hey, Steve, before we log off, I just want to congratulate Brandon for guessing 3 out of the 4 locations that we are at, but Makena has stumped them all. So congratulations, Makena. You want to announce where you are, Makena?
Yeah, I'm in the room of requirement. So it's in Hogwarts. It only appears when you need it. So
great.
How cool is that? How cool is that? So with that, we'll say everybody have a great day. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
thank you.